Welcome to Praise, Prayer and Preaching with the Reverend Dr. Keith Garner.
This evening, here in the Wesley Theatre in Sydney, we continue in our brief midwinter excursion into Matthew's Gospel. And we arrive at certainly what might be described as one of the best known parables of Jesus. Invariably, it's referred to as the parable of the sower, when in point of fact, it's certainly not that. Sometimes people say it's about sowing, other people say it's about seed. It's about neither of those things, it's about soil. Fundamentally, the parable does not focus on the one casting the seed out, nor upon, for that matter, that which is cast, though many people might want to allegorically say that's where the focus should be, but it's about the soil and the different kinds of soil that exist. And so therefore, it is really about receptivity. It's about the reception of the seed cast by the sower into the different kinds of soil. It's a very descriptive account of the farming methods of the day, but there is one thing before I give you one person's shortened version that we need to know about the sowing methods of the day. They ploughed everything in afterwards, not before. Now, if you were to go and talk to any farmer in most parts of the world and talk about how they do it, they would plough the fields, and when the fields are prepared, they would sow the seed. That's not how it was done. How it was done was the seed was cast indiscriminately and then ploughed in. So Jesus goes through the eye to the heart. That's what he does when he teaches. He takes something that is maybe everyday, and he profoundly uses it to exemplify a deeper truth. And this is really one of those passages. Remember, it opens up the very same day. Jesus went out of the house, sat by the lake. The crowds were so great, he got in a boat and he looked up. And when he looked up, very likely there would be a sower. So the context of the parable is an everyday scene around the lake. And if you go to that northwestern part of the Lake Galilee, there was plenty of sowing going on in the sea. And the seed was sown in the fields and there was a harvest, so he used it. Maybe he even said, look up there. I don't know. But I think it puts a context to the story that Jesus told. And we have a common agricultural scene that has the ability to breach all those differences, age, education, cultural context, and speak into hearts. Have you ever wondered what it was that drew people to the ministry of Jesus? If it is true to the New Testament, I'm certain that his teaching ministry has to be part of that reason. Yes, of course it's true that people came and in the edge of towns they heard things. I mean, how could Bartimaeus have cried out had he not heard stories that others were sharing? Yes, they talked about the miracles that he performed. Certainly his presence and his call to the disciples and to others was compelling. But his teaching, he taught with authority, not as the scribes and Pharisees did at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, is one of those verses at the end of chapter 7 you could easily slip by. But it's so important in understanding why people were attracted. You see, his stories had some originality about them. It's very interesting when you look at the stories of Jesus. True that there are images he uses elsewhere, and certainly there are stories that have their allusion to other parts of the Old Testament and other religious and cultural images of the day. But there is a uniqueness about the teaching methods of Jesus, through the eye to the heart. And so it is that Jesus' teaching is against this background that I've talked about already, the do's and the don'ts, and those people whose religion was bound up with rules and regulations. And the conclusions that Jesus came to was not to tell people what they must think, but to offer to them in stories and pictures, models and words that they would then need to make their own conclusions about. How many times did Jesus do that? I mean, when people were trying to get answers out of him, he said, who do you think? And what do you think? He threw it back to people to be able to not just make their own conclusions, but to search their hearts in an adequate response to him. Now, that's not to suggest that there is no moral compass in the teaching of Jesus, that he didn't offer to us very clear ways about how we should live. But there's an irresistible magnet in the teaching of Jesus that calls people, that enables them to think for themselves and think through what faith and discipleship might mean for them. And the question of opposition that was beginning to mount is confirmed, it seems to me, in the Matthean context as well as in Mark. We note that the message of Jesus is being rejected by the religious leaders, and their critical spirit quite disturbed the disciples. Another interesting aspect of this parable seems to lie in the fact that this is one of the only parables, that there's probably one in the weeds that we shall refer to, that seems to have explanations for it. Most writers on the parables say you make a distinction between a parable and an allegory. But these are two of the more problematical passages, because we find in the Gospel that there's some kinds of words of explanation going on. But it seems to me that we can take that traditional view of the parable and say, what is the one overriding message that the parable is seeking to say to you at home and to all of us as we open the scriptures in this day? The disciples at the time were well aware of the difficulties that were beginning to hinder responses to Jesus. It could be that they were struggling in their own response to Jesus. But if we keep in mind that larger picture, I think it will help us. If the point of the parable is the receptivity of the soil, then we can take it for granted there's nothing wrong with the seed. The seed is good. At no point in this parable, and in nothing that I've ever read of anybody said about this parable, has everybody said there's something wrong with the seed. Nobody has said, though they might have questioned in their minds because they don't understand the agricultural methods of the day, they might have thought the sower got it wrong. He should have spent his time going to the places that were good, but how did he know the places that were good? There's all kinds of questions that arise when we begin to examine that in ourselves. Joachim Jeremias, to me one of the best writers on the parables, wrote this about this particular parable. To human eyes, much of the labor may seem futile and fruitless, resulting apparently in frequent failure. But Jesus is full of joyful confidence. God's hour is coming and will bring with it a harvest of reward beyond all asking and understanding. In spite of every failure and every opposition, God brings from hopeless beginnings the glorious end that he has promised. Let me offer to you 4 reflections in the time it usually takes 3 on the different components of receptivity and the quality of the soil presented to us. First of all, let's look at the receptivity of the pathway. We read in verse 4 here, in terms of this receptivity, as he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. You remember, in the old Bible, it said, some fell along the wayside. Lovely thought with the wayside. The trouble with wayside is we've tended to use that and we've given it an image, haven't we? We say, he's fallen by the wayside, you know. And that's not really quite what's meant in this particular context. Around a field, however, there was a pathway. And the reason why it's important to stress this was the very pathway that the sower would walk along. So let's not condemn the pathway of itself, but that pathway enabled the sower to go about his job. And that pathway would be hard trampled by continuous use. It would prevent growth. You know what it's like when something gets hard. It's very hard to push through it. And such a pathway would mean that the soil was unable to receive the seed. Everything seems to be on the surface. Now you can start to say, yeah, now let's take something from this. Let's open it up and say to ourselves, what about those places which are just surface level? Just those things that are on the surface. What are those things in our lives and in the life of the world in which we live that prevent any meaningful depth? One writer of the parable said this, whatever is kept on the surface of life will be snatched away. The birds are constantly in the Gospels, imagery for Gentiles. You can make all kinds of things out of this. But it seems to me the most important thing is it is on the surface, and because it's on the surface, it doesn't take root. Does the pathway remind us of the hard-hearted? Those who don't warm to the message of Jesus? Did the disciples say, yeah, Jesus, we understand that. We understand about the pathways. The point is that some people are unmoved by the message of Christ. We see it every day in another dimension in our work sometimes. We know that we're speaking very clearly for those people who've got no voice for themselves, that in the very real socio-political context in which we minister, we know very well that when we speak what we believe to be right, some people are just not ready to receive it. We live at this time through very difficult and challenging times when people need to speak up, and they do need to speak up. When people get in a boat, halfway around the world to find their way to Australia, that's no mean trip. That's not something you simply choose to do. And when you start to speak up for such people, as we must, as we speak for them, some people just don't want to know. They've got it all worked out in their mind. And the reality is that there is sometimes an unreceptivity to that which is right. People have become cynical in their contexts. I found myself just in a difficult place, really, a couple of weeks ago when I had to travel to Queensland to be part of with a group of people that were talking about new programs that our government were introducing, and I say this openly on the TV, talking about the fact that we're moving from 50 different levels and understandings of how people are going to be supported to just 4. We just hope people don't fall through the big, big cracks that exist between 4. And we talked all day about the different reflections that we wanted to make about this. Then at the end of the day, the very senior people with the minister said, is there anybody not said anything about, they've not been heard on something they wanted to say? Nobody was saying a word. And I thought, well, you're in for a penny, you might as well be in for the lot here. And I said, look, if I don't say this, I'll burst. We do not help people simply for a financial outcome. We help people because they need helping. And it seems to me that sometimes you can be like that sower with seed that falls on ground that is only surface and doesn't really want to take root. You see, this has got far more to do than simply sermons. It's to do with what is right and true about life. We need to guard against the temptation of tailoring our message and our work in such a way that it's softened in a way that makes it easy to receive. The call is for disciples, not supporters, to create disciple-shaped communities and to call for resilience in the face of opposition. People have different perceptions and controlling views about how they see the world. We must never become impervious to the word of Christ, which is our hope. And when it's empowered by the Spirit of God, it brings life and meaning into people's lives. Secondly, let's talk about the receptivity of rocky places in verse 5. Verse 5 says, some fell on rocky places where it didn't have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. The rocky places in this parable would seem to be those areas which have a mere surface covering of soil. Now, the thing about that is this. If there's a surface covering of soil, then it looks just like a deep covering. To the eye, they look no different. But in terms of fruit and receptivity, they are so fundamentally different at different ends of a pole or scale. And the seed springs up quickly. There's always a danger, when things spring up quickly. The worst thing that can happen is we can think winter's over. Did you think that this week? That's it, 25 degrees. We're out there and we're basking in the sun. Then you went home that night and you thought, whatever's happened? Somebody down Antarctica is blowing it all the way up to us. And we realize you cannot bank on things being done. And the worst thing that can happen is a very easy, quick response of the seed. It sprang up quickly. Too swift a germination produces weak maturity. Eagerness is fruitless if it hasn't got depth. A fickle and unreliable response is warned about. And the challenge of this particular response is from the outset, it looks quite promising. If we put this into the context of the life of the early church, there might have been those people making a surface response. There might have been those people that were deciding that here's a new religious way, here's a new thing happening, we'll get along and in there with it. And as they made their surface response, as the seed germinated very quickly, so they fell away. But you see, human personality is capable of swift and enthusiastic responses that go quickly wrong. Craig Blomberg, in his preaching on the parables, offered 4 ready responses to the ministry of Jesus that may well have been in the mind of Jesus, and the mind of the disciples, the minds of the first readers and hearers of this parable. First, that there were those who were opponents, particularly upon the Jewish leaders hostile to Christ. They may well have been one response. There would be the large crowds. So much so in this context, the large crowds, it was the large crowds that forced him out of the house, down to the side of the water and into the boat. There would be the large crowds. There was the intriguing case of Judas, and maybe Judas and his like represent another response to Jesus. But finally, there might have been those who remained very close, even though they weren't without their flaws. Let's look at the dreadful thorns of life, verse 7. I said it wasn't that long, didn't I? Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. The soil described here is neither hard on the surface or shallow. It's good soil. But in the soil are those things that choke the growth. One of the most important lessons any gardener ever learns is the importance of weeds and the removal thereof. In these ecological days, there is a belief that perhaps there are no such thing as weeds. I've heard somebody present that case very, very well. I felt I wanted to ask this lady to come back to our garden for a few hours after she'd not believed in weeds. But I understand that a weed is perhaps something that we haven't discovered how to harness and how to make right. That's maybe one view of life. But the thorns that choke is the image that Jesus used. They grew up and choked the plants. There's perhaps the most concerning, this is the most concerning of the 3 responses so far. In his commentary, Ralph Earl explained, these things threaten the spiritual life of every Christian and cause the spiritual death of many. These are the strangled hearts whose lives have been overcrowded with things until God consciousness is choked out. In this parable, Jesus pointed out that the farmer didn't cease sowing because there was a pathway, because there was rocky surfaces, and because there were thorns. This might remind all of us when we're looking at these things that prevent a ready response. We must face our hesitations and our fears and continue to engage in the life and ministry of Christ. We must be realistic about the reality of evil, about those things that come along and choke the goodness out of situations. There are some people who become so focused on stopping things rather than doing things, of pulling things back rather than building things up, who have that excitement about what they can spoil rather than what they can help. Are they like those thorns that are somehow choking the life out of the seed that is growing? We must remain confident, even if we can't see the harvest. Then fourthly, this of course is the bit we shouldn't forget. there is good and receptive soil. In verse 8, still other seed fell on good soil, where it produced a crop 100, 60, or 30 times what is sown. Whoever has ears, let him hear. How many of us have put all the concentration on what's gone before? When this parable reaches a crescendo, a climax in good soil. It's soil that actually receives the seed and nourishes it to full growth. Good soil, of course, will always point beyond itself to a harvest it produces. Will always leave us amazed. I mean, that's the great thing about 160 and 30. You're amazed at the fruit, amazed at the crop. It's over and above, to use Pauline scripture elsewhere, above everything we ask or ever imagined, through the grace that is poured out for us. And good soil is the only decent and proper response to the word of Christ. When I read this parable, inevitably my mind turns to the question that is certainly true as I read this. What was going on in the life of this church? Well, clearly there were those that were making quick responses. There were clearly those people that were making too quick a response. There were those people that were hindered by those things that choked out their lives. But thank God, in these early days, there were those for whom the seed was taking root in the soil, and what a harvest was being produced. As Jesus taught these words, the disciples were beginning to see, even through the truth was receiving negative responses, there will be a good response. The parable of the sower is not only one of the best known parables of Jesus, but it's often preached and taught. I am, however, reminded by Haddon Robinson, the old writer on preaching from the parables resembles playing the saxophone. It's easy to do poorly, very easy. And it's so easy to hear these words and so try to translate them into an easy, selective way and not realize that what God is saying, are you good soil? Are you receptive to the truth of Christ? Or have you so put up a barrier? Have you so locked yourself in a box? Have you so heard it so many times? You've heard it now, you know it all, that you're not ready to receive the fresh, invigorating seed of God into the soil of your heart and your life. The fourth kind of soil requires attention. But if that seed falls on good earth, if it takes root, if it comes to maturity, the crop, we're told, is going to bear fruit. At the heart of Wesley Mission, what we want to do, in the heart of this congregation, what we want to do is we don't simply want to do what we've done forever and ever. We want to create a context in which people who are good soil will receive the word of Christ. It will be so nourished in their lives that 100, 60, and 30 will be the harvest. The reason for the parable, of course, is the thrust that you find in it. That there will be failures and challenges. You might have said to that sower, come on, just watch a few times and see where it best lands. But you don't know that. You see, there is an indiscriminate scattering of the seed. The real picture of the scattering of the seed has to be an early Israel-Palestine context of a basket with the seed thrown out everywhere and anywhere. And it's only in the end, by their fruits you will know them. It is only when the harvest comes up that you really know the difference. The reason the parable so challenges us is that our efforts are not always measurable. We don't always see the harvest. And sometimes it takes longer than we want it to be. We like that quick response. It may take time. It can be at many different levels. Think about the people who have contributed to your life. I think of the Sunday school teachers, the youth leaders, the people who nurtured you in faith. And sometimes they might have looked at what they did for you. I think of the people who've touched my life. I was thrown out of the youth club so many times and invited to come back by youth leaders who believed in me. And how many of you have had people who believed in you, so much so that it was costly and hard and difficult? But eventually, something really came out of that fruit. Think of China. Do you know, in 1959 in China, there were about 1.5 million Christians. The figure, even at the lowest figures, is 60 million and climbing. I think the figure is probably higher. And I remember when I began my ministry, belonging to a little Bible study. It was a Fellowship of the Kingdom Bible study. And I met with a lot of older men. They were mainly men in those days. And they sat round, many of them been ministers. I remember one. He had worked for the Methodist Missionary Society in China. Wilfred Pyle was his name. And he and his wife were thrown out of China. And he said they were walking up the gangway, as you do. And he said to his wife, you know, this is going to be an awful day for China. Because they were all being thrown out. You remember the great ejection of Christian missionaries. And it was his wife, not him. His wife who said to him, no, it will be the making of China. And I can tell you it has been, is, and will be. That new leaders have emerged and it's not now just a surface response. Oh, how there's been a response, 160 and 30. Beyond all that we ask or imagine, according to the Spirit that works within us. How do you explain the effectiveness of God's word in difficult situations and different ones? Well, it's about soil. So I suppose here's a question you've not been asked very often. What kind of soil are you, friends? What kind of soil are you? Are you the soil that is hard-pressed? And you're unresponsive to what you know is true. You're hard-beaten. You've heard it before. You don't need it anymore. Or are you that kind of soil that has an appearance of growth? Or perhaps, sadly, are you one who's made a response but you've been choked by the cares of this world? Or are you, and I hope you can respond this way tonight, are you the kind of soil that is ready to receive the seed and see a harvest? May God make us as a congregation, as Christians, and as a community, the last kind.